Welcome to day 5 of our 1000 Days of Revealing Christ challenge. Let me ask you a question that might make you very uncomfortable. Do you actually trust God or are you just scared of Him? You see, many believers are suffering from something we call cognitive dissonance. Most of them are in a situation where they actually see Jesus saving them from God. They love Jesus, but they are terrified of God the Father. You see, millions of believers say that they trust God, but deep down, many of us are just afraid of His punishment. My friend recently told me, I trust Jesus and I love Jesus, but I find it very hard to love the God of the Old Testament simply because of the things that we see Him doing in the Old Testament. And rightly so. Anyone can hate the God of the Old Testament. A famous atheist biologist and author called Richard Dawkins, in his 206 book called The God Delusion, in the opening of chapter 2, he writes, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Those are very heavy words to use on God. And honestly speaking, it's not only atheists who view God like this. Even believers. Probably you're there and you also view God like that. And rightly so, because that is what the Old Testament portrays concerning God. I want you to know that you're not alone. You're not the only person who is wrestling with this nature of God. In fact, in the early church, precisely on the 2nd century, there was a believer named Marcion of Sinope who taught that the God of the Old Testament was a completely different and inferior being from the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He viewed the Old Testament God as harsh and violent, concerned only with strict justice and war, while Jesus revealed a previously unknown God of pure love and mercy. Marcion, while wrestling with this idea of the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God that is revealed to us by Jesus Christ, reached to the conclusion that was later declared a heresy by the church of that time, that the God of the Old Testament has to be a different God from the God of the New Testament. In fact, according to Marcion, that God had to be inferior to the God of the New Testament. And yet this was a believer. So you're not wrong to ask these questions. You're not wrong to wrestle with the idea of the Old Testament God seeming as if he is a monster. And if we are honest, every Christian quietly and internally wrestles with this violence that we read in the Old Testament. We are going to go deep into those hard questions in the coming days of this challenge. But today, I want to leave you in the comfort of one simple truth. Jesus is the perfect image of God. Think about the life of Jesus. He's our only true witness to who God is. And Jesus died with a clean slate. He died with a perfect record. We never saw Jesus killing anyone. In fact, we see him raising the dead. So we can rest in the truth that God does not kill. We never saw Jesus destroying anybody. In fact, we see him restoring. So you can rest in the truth that God does not destroy. Even when he was arrested and his disciple Peter cut off a soldier's ear, Jesus didn't fight back. In fact, he takes the ear that has been cut and puts it back on the soldier and rebukes Peter for the violence. When there were storms, we saw Jesus calming them. So we can be rest assured that it is not God who sends storms and tsunamis and things like hurricanes. Do you remember Luke 9 when the disciples wanted to call fire from heaven to destroy a Samaritan village like Elijah did? Jesus stopped them and rebuked them, and he told them, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of." He made his mission clear. I have not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Now think with me. If Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that means that he is the same God who was in the Old Testament. But that doesn't mean that the Old Testament God changed. It only means that we must allow Jesus to change our perception of him. So before we do the hard work of explaining these difficult passages in the Old Testament, I want you to find your rest here. I want to leave you in the place of comfort. I want to leave you in the hands of Jesus. I want to leave you with this undeniable truth that God looks exactly like Jesus. There might be contradictions in what we see in the Old Testament versus what Jesus shows us in the New Testament. I want you to settle with what Jesus Christ shows you in the New Testament before we go back into the Old Testament and wrestle with those hard passages, which we shall do in the course of this challenge. But for today, I want you to know that Jesus is the one who gives us the perfect image of God. Jesus is the only one who can show us the true nature and the true character of God. If Jesus never did it, God didn't do it, God has never done it, and God will never do it. I know there are a lot of questions that are going to follow after that, which we are going to handle, but I want to leave you in the hands of Jesus. You can trust Jesus. You can remain rested in Jesus, and you can allow Jesus to comfort you with the truth that he is the one who shows us what God is truly like.